Let's talk about the rhetorical situation today. Now, before I begin, you should know that I have the dogs inside. So I have Cooper playing with something over there, and I have the little black dog eating breakfast right here next to me. So anyway, welcome to my world. Let's talk about the rhetorical situation. So there is no good acronym for remembering these things, but you do need to remember the rhetorical situation. For us, we get bags or C. That's what you get. So we have purpose, audience, genre, style, and document design or context. So I was looking online and I found this model, which I stole it. So, but I really like this model because it kind of gives you a nice image of what the rhetorical situation actually looks like, but it also incorporates the idea of logos, ethos, and pathos. So what I want you to understand is that the rhetorical situation can incorporate a variety of different types of terms, but in any regard, the rhetorical situation is ultimately the framework of a sender, a message, and a receiver, which we've spoken about before, and I'll actually come back to that in just a second. So I really like this model, and hopefully my cursor shows up here, because we have our writer, our audience, and our subject, and then surrounding all of that is the context or framework for why the document or message has been constructed and how it's being sent to the receivers. So within that, we have our ethos, which of course is our ethical consideration. We have our logos, which is our logical consideration, and then we have our pathos, which is our emotional response. What this model particularly does is it demonstrates where logos, ethos, and pathos tend to fall, and I think Aristotle would tend to agree to some extent with the way that this falls. And I think that you also have to remember that the best logical arguments include kind of a relatively even component of, or a combination of all of these things. And yet I'm jumping ahead in my notes. So there I go again, doing this, the scenic route to get to my point. But no matter what, as a reader and as a writer, you need to remember that there is always a purpose and an audience. Those are the two key components to any rhetorical situation. What is the purpose in something that is being written or spoken or presented, and who is receiving that information? Now, when you start writing, when you're writing your essays or a research paper, a multiple source paper, perhaps you're writing a letter of recommendation, or you're writing a college application essay or some sort of document like that where you're trying to persuade somebody that you are the best candidate, then your purpose is, of course, persuasion. Your audience is whoever is receiving that message from you. So this is really nice because we can see the context, and you can generate your context based on what you understand as either the writer or the reader. And you have a writer, an audience, and a message to send. So that incorporates the logos, ethos, and pathos. Okay? All right. Now, let's get more specific into some of the content of why it's important to evaluate the rhetorical situation in both reading and writing. And I will keep this brief because I don't think I need the full 15 minutes to convey this content. We need to get to the actual application of this. This is really actually pretty much common sense. So I scrolled down, but let me scroll back up for a very quick second and remind you that the rhetorical situation is your pegs d or s, k. It's a terrible acronym. Anyway, purpose, audience, genre, style, and document. Now we can pause and break down and figure out what genre is, but I believe that you know what genre is. We have the primary categories of genre in terms of fiction, nonfiction. Then you can start breaking them down as far as adult fiction, true fiction. True fiction is an oxymoron. That there is no such thing as true fiction. Things like true crime, that was kind of what I was thinking. I didn't do a good job of that. You can have fantasy, you can have romance, you can have science fiction, you can have fantasy, etc., etc. Okay, but then you can further break down genre into style, and you can think about the type of construction of that document that you want to write. So if you wanted to write fantasy, but you so you wanted to write fantasy, but you didn't have a full story. Maybe it's just a short story. Okay, so you have novel length, you have short story length, you have flash fiction. Maybe you have an essay or an article or an editorial. And actually, I'm jumping ahead again. Then you have your document designer context. So let's just stick with the notes. So when you're reading, the thing that you need to be most aware of is that these terms might change with your various models, but overall they're essentially the same thing. What I really find most important for you as my students to understand is that every document has a purpose and an audience. All of the rest of the stuff, that all comes together later. And I'm not ultimately too concerned with that. Sure, I want you to be able to identify some of those things, but I want you to consider, what is this author's purpose and who is the intended audience? Am I the intended audience? And so therefore, am I helping the author fulfill his or her purpose? Excuse me. So definitely don't forget what we've already learned about having a sender and a receiver with a message between them. Certainly do not forget the idea of noise that emerges around a message based on your sender and receiver, but also the rest of the context surrounding the message. Okay, and something that is very, very important that you really need to think about. Well, there are three things that I think that you really need to think about as a reader of any text, no matter what it is. First, what is the author presenting to you, and how do you understand that? First of all, you have to evaluate their motivations. In Abolition of Man, I think that your understanding emerges over time. You don't get a clear understanding immediately because it is a relatively difficult text for a variety of reasons. It's really interesting that some of you, when initially responding to this text, talked about how it's hard to read because he uses such formal language and he uses such formal punctuation. That's designed to help you to understand him better. As you become more fluent readers, more consistent readers, you'll recognize that the placement of a comma has a lot of value in understanding where emphasis should be and where to pause and where to reflect. So you have to think about this. That's part of the motivation of an author, because if an author just runs stuff together like they might in a text like Johnny Got His Gun, where there's no punctuation, which is an anti-war novel and really very brutal. The song, the video, Metallica, Nothing Else Matters. Is that the name of the song? That's basically a response to that text. I would encourage you to watch that video. It's pretty fascinating. But anyway, punctuation helps us to understand an author's motivation, and we have to pay attention to it. Word usage helps us to understand an author's motivation, as does the overall context, the logos, ethos, pathos, the entire construction of the message. Okay, so you have to really think about that. It may not be clear from the outset. Ideally, I'm teaching you to start with a thesis that helps to direct your motivation, but you don't always get that in all of the things that you will read. So it may take you time. Secondly, please be careful of applying your own motivations to the understanding of the text, although they are important. Your own motivations tend to articulate your bias that you take into a text, whatever you're feeling as you have chosen to read this, and then as you're reading it and why you're reading it. So be careful of that. Be aware of your own motivations, but don't continually insert it. What I'm trying to suggest is that you're ultimately open-minded so that the rhetorical situation from the author can actually wash over you and become more clear. Okay? And finally, as you begin to search for meaning in a text, evaluate how your understandings are altered by what you know about the context of the message, or how that context is growing as you read, as you develop your ideas, change your ideas, become more clear in your ideas. Okay, so that's for reading. Now, we're going to spend quite a lot of time thinking about this portion, but you really need to consider the rhetorical situation when you are writing. So I might assign something to you and say, now go forth and prosper, and you might say, I have no idea where to even start. You always know where to start because you always have to find your purpose. Okay, so that's the very first thing. So what are you writing? Are you writing a research paper? Are you writing an opinion-based essay? Are you trying to persuade me of something? What are you attempting to accomplish here? So when you're writing, you'll do the same thing. So you evaluate your own purpose. Why are you writing? Is it because I told you to? Okay, well, there's one purpose. I mean, it's not a great reason because you should be writing anyway. But once you start writing, you have to buy into whatever it is that you are writing. And it should become something that you're writing for yourself, no longer for me, okay? So you think, why are you writing and what are you planning to write? Then you consider who your audience will be. Now, it's very easy for you in a classroom to say, well, my teacher's my audience. Duh. But that's not a fair response to doing the work on the writing. You have to generalize your audience. You have to, in my instance, you have to think about a fairly well-educated, intelligent, middle-aged woman. Okay, that's fair, right? But is this also something that you want to present to other people? And that will help to define what genre you're going to use. You know, like how are you going to style all of these things. Now, the next three components kind of merge together to some degree because it's sometimes difficult to separate them. If you wanted to write a novel for me, then obviously you're not going to tweet it. And if you're going to, I mean, right? They oppose one another, a novel and a tweet. Okay, secondly, how formal or informal is that going to be? I mean, if you want to go through a traditional publishing route on your novel, you better have a pretty solid grasp of editing and the writing process. If you plan to write with no punctuation, what's your reason in doing that? If you plan to not capitalize a single word, what's your reason in doing that? Is that going to fly in the context of the message that you're sending? In a tweet, no problem. Piece of cake, go for it. Do what you got to do. Okay. So you have to think about the genre and the style together, because style is going to be, of course, formal, informal, professional versus, less professional, et cetera, et cetera. Your document design or your context of your actual document is still another matter. So you have to think about how you're going to design this. Are you going to use a lot of color? Is it vibrant? Is it graphic? Is it some kind of a graphic art? Or is it heavy text on the page? Is it dense text? And or are you gonna use a lot of white space? Like in a resume, you would use a lot of white space. There's so much to consider when you are writing and presenting your message, because messages come in so many different ways. So do reflect back on the message sender and receiver discussion that we had previously, and you might review that lecture if you're a little hazy there. So there's quite a lot to think about when it comes to why you're reading something and why you are writing something. And on that note, I think I'll pause, and I sure took almost 15 minutes. I'll get better. Have a great day.